Hello everyone, I am Ricky Williams and this is Sunday School Class with Ricky. Welcome to our new series of studies, this time taken from the Book of Esther found in the Old Testament of the Bible. Over the next several lessons, we will explore one of the most fascinating books in the entire Bible. It is a story filled with political intrigue, danger, courage, unexpected reversals, and a remarkable deliverance. It contains heroes, villains, kings, queens, banquets, and conspiracies. Yet, it also presents one of the most intriguing puzzles in Scripture. And that's because God is never mentioned by name in this book. Before we begin studying the story itself, it is important that we understand the historical setting of the book and some of the unique features that make Esther unlike any other book of the Bible. So, let's study together. The events of Esther take place during the Persian period of Jewish history. To understand the setting, we need to go back to the Babylonian exile. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The temple was destroyed and many Jews were taken into exile back to Babylon. Several decades later, Babylon itself was conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great. In 539 BC, Cyrus captured Babylon and very soon thereafter issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. Many Jews returned under leaders such as Zerubbabel, Ezra, and later Nehemiah. However, not all Jews returned. Large Jewish communities remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire. The Book of Esther tells us the story of some of those Jews who remained behind. The events are generally dated to the reign of King Ahasuerus, who is later or usually identified historically as King Xerxes I, who ruled Persia from approximately 486 to 465 BC. In our next class, we'll talk a bit more about the history around King Xerxes I. Now this places Esther between the events of Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. So it's thought. In other words, during the events of Esther, the temple had already been rebuilt in Jerusalem, the second temple, yet many Jews were still living throughout the Persian Empire. Esther tells us what happened to those Jews. The story takes place primarily in the Persian capital of Susa, also called Shushan, and at the height of its power, the Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia and controlled an enormous territory. The opening verses of Esther describe the king ruling over 127 provinces, emphasizing the vastness of the empire. Now, let's look at a few interesting facts about the Book of Esther. One interesting feature of Esther is that it is one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman. The other, of course, is the Book of Ruth. Both books feature women as the central human characters, but their stories are quite different. Ruth is set in a humble, rural environment and focuses on family, loyalty, and faithfulness. Esther is set in the palace of the most powerful empire in the world and focuses on national survival and political courage. Both women become instruments through whom God's purposes are accomplished. Both women also risk their futures for the benefit of others. These 2 books highlight the important role women played in God's redemptive purposes. Another interesting fact, and possibly the most interesting one, is that the book of Esther never once mentions God. Not once. In fact, there is no mention of God, no mention of prayer, although it does mention fasting, no mention of worship, no mention of the temple, no mention of sacrifices, no mention of Jerusalem. This makes Esther unique among the books of the Bible. For centuries, scholars and readers have asked, well, why would a book of scripture never mention God? Of course, there are many theories, but some scholars believe this omission is intentional. Although God's name never appears, his presence seems to be felt everywhere throughout the book. Throughout the story, we find a remarkable series of events that appear to be coincidences. Esther becomes queen, Mordecai overhears a plot against the king just happens to suffer insomnia at exactly the right moment, and that causes him to read the royal records at exactly the right time. Haman then enters the court at exactly the wrong moment for himself, and the entire story is built around what appears to be a number of coincidences. Yet, when viewed together, they suggest something greater is at work. Many readers have described Esther as a book about the hidden providence of God. God is invisible in the story, but his fingerprints seem to be everywhere. The lesson is powerful. Even when God seems absent, he may still be working behind the scenes. A third interesting fact about Esther, and this comes about concerning Esther and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves named near Qumran by the Dead Sea. They contain portions of nearly every book in the Old Testament. However, one book was notably absent. Yes, Esther. No fragment of Esther has ever been identified among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This has, of course, led to much discussion among scholars. Why was Esther missing? And again, several possibilities and theories have been suggested. Some scholars just believe that the community at Qumran simply did not use Esther. Others suggest that they may have possessed copies, but that those copies have not survived throughout time. Still others note that Esther's strong association with the festival of Purim, which we'll get to in subsequent lessons, that may have conflicted with some of the beliefs of the Qumran community. The truth is, we do not know for certain. What we do know is that despite its absence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Esther was widely accepted within Judaism and eventually became part of the Hebrew Bible. Then, the fact that the book speaks about the festival of Purim. The book of Esther is unique because it explains the origin of a Jewish festival known as Purim. Purim is still celebrated by the Jews around the world up to this present day. The name comes from the word pur, or pur, meaning a lot or casting of lots. And of course we'll see how this comes up later in the story. The festival commemorates the deliverance of the Jewish people from Haman's plot. So to this day, the book of Esther is publicly read during Purim celebrations. This means that Esther is not only a biblical book, but also the foundation of a living religious tradition that continues more than 2,000 years later. Finally, another interesting fact is questions surrounding the historicity of the book. Another interesting aspect of Esther is that scholars debate its historical character. Some scholars view the book as straightforward history. Others believe it is a historical novella, that is, a story rooted in a real Persian setting but written with literary techniques to teach theological lessons. There are some details in Esther that match what we do know about Persian customs and court life. At the same time, there are one or two elements that some historians find difficult to verify. For example, the name of the wife of Xerxes I, which we do have from historical records and doesn't seem to match up with either Vashti or Esther. That's one of those mysteries we have to resolve currently. But regardless of where one stands in that debate, the book reflects an authentic Persian environment and provides valuable insight into Jewish life during the diaspora. So, as we begin our study, there are several themes to watch for throughout the book. Providence. God works behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes. Courage. Esther risks her own life to save her people. Reversal, my favorite. Throughout the story, fortunes are dramatically reversed. The powerful become powerless. The condemned become victorious. The hunter becomes the hunted. I like that one. Then there's identity. Esther struggles with whether to conceal or reveal her Jewish identity. And then there is survival. The book tells the story of how the Jewish people escaped destruction. Without that deliverance, the future history of Israel and ultimately the coming of the Messiah would have been affected. So how do we conclude this first introductory lesson? Well, as we begin this study, Esther challenges us to consider an important question. What do we do when God seems absent? Many believers have experienced seasons when God appears to be silent. There are no miracles, no visions, no dramatic interventions. Yet, Esther reminds us that God does not need to announce his presence in order to be present. Sometimes his greatest work occurs behind the scenes. The Book of Esther invites us to look beyond coincidence and to trust that God is at work even when we cannot see him. In our next lesson, we'll begin with chapter 1 and examine some more historical background of King Ahasuerus, his extravagant court, the great banquet he held, and the events that led up to the removal of Queen Vashti and set the stage for Esther's rise to prominence. I trust you would join us then. Until then, I trust you would continue to join us for our lessons. Like the video, share, subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate those of you who have done that already, and we look forward to many more of you doing that. We trust that as we go through this series, it would be a great blessing to you. So we'll see you for our next class, and until then, God bless you.